Hello and welcome. I'm Joshua Nossiter. I was a 79. And my father, Bernard D. Nossiter, 47, is the man in whose honor these lectures were founded. In fact, it was a decade and a half ago, just over. The late John Kenneth Galbraith was here, and he delivered the inaugural talk in this lecture series. It was friendship for my late father that brought him here to Hanover. And Galbraith was the ideal speaker for the occasion. About my father's first book, The Mythmakers, Galbraith wrote, "Nossiter's idea is to cultivate belief rather than fashionable applause. This revolutionary notion has made him one of the country's most influential economic reporters." The Mythmakers was the product of Dad's Nieman year at Harvard, 1963. Like his undergraduate days in Hanover, where he'd had precious memories of stringing for the New York Times, also of getting through an entire winter term in a single pair of brown corduroy trousers, that Nieman year was the highlight of Dad's life. His passions ranged from restoration comedy to archaeology to macroeconomics. And having the run of a great college or even a reasonable facsimile in that university in Cambridge was an unending delight. Both Dartmouth and Harvard were very good places for a man on a lifelong quest to get the story right. And getting the story right for him meant reading everything he could on any subject that he was covering. Burning shoe leather. As a young reporter, he developed flat feet, stalking the halls of Congress, buttonholing officials. Giving what he called the business side of the newspaper, and this was the Washington Post in those days, heartburn, endless toll calls, transatlantic cablegrams in the days of the cablegram, lavish expense account entertaining of possible sources, talking to anyone who talked to him, and he was very good at getting people to talk to him, and asking hard questions, rejecting the party line, despising handouts, press releases, and PR, distilling everything he learned into a compact, clear, and sturdy account, knowing he'd done his job if somebody very powerful was made very angry by what he'd written. Viewing the world with a kind of superb self-assurance that was really based on an unmatched command of the facts. The first speaker in the series, John Kenneth Galbraith, also had a kind of Augustan self-assurance, especially on those rare occasions when he was completely in the wrong. My son Jason, who's here in the audience today, was by my side in the lobby of the Hanover Inn 16 or so years ago on a frigid spring day, a bit like this one. We met up with Galbraith, who towered down from his 6'8" height and looked at my then 11-year-old son and said, "So, where do you intend to go to college?" Given the circumstances, the natural answer was, "Dartmouth?" Galbraith looked down at him. "Harvard is better, you know." Jason got the last word. He went to the land of perpetual sunshine and a campus with 2 beaches, University of California at Santa Barbara. Today, that looks like a really smart choice. For Galbraith and my father both, mendacious officials didn't misspeak or misremember. They lied. Greedy corporations didn't take advantage of market conditions or creative accounting. They stole and then cooked the books. Neither had any interest in the pretense of unbiased and nonpartisanship that's held up as an ideal nowadays. And both treated wealthy and powerful malefactors with perfectly even-handed disdain. Dad ignored the spin dished up by what he would have called flax. He had no time for mealy-mouthed and self-serving officialdom. Instead, he called it as he saw it, fearlessly, confidently, knowledgeably, completely unashamedly. To him, it was just good reporting, which he did for over 30 years for the Washington Post and the New York Times. My brothers and my mother, with the help of Professors Edward Bradley and Michael Ermarth, and the great support of the Rockefeller Center, established these lectures as a forum for practitioners of good reporting, the real, essential truth-tellers. They are the lone voices in the wilderness, unafraid to declare the emperor clothesless. That was my dad's favorite story, but he didn't regard it as a fairy tale. We need those voices now more than ever. Dad was one, J.K. Galbraith was another. Our guest tonight, Nazila Fathi, is yet another. We're honored to have her here today. Readers of the New York Times really don't need an introduction to her courageous, bold, insightful reporting from Iran. So, without further ado, Nazila Fathi, thank you.
Well, hello, and thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's very cold today, but still, it feels warm inside. I'm going to talk about Iran and Egypt. The interesting thing is that exactly at the same time, in February, when protests erupted in Cairo, the Iranian parliament was very angry at Mr. Ahmadinejad because he had spent $50 million without informing the parliament what he had done with the money. For a week, there was huge commotion in parliament, pressing even for impeaching the president to see what he had done with the money. After a while, everything was over. The money was well spent. He had given $50,000 to each local cleric around the country. And another $5,000 in loans for cars were underway. The parliament gave up. I guess this is the biggest difference between Iran and Egypt, that Iran can afford to buy support. Iran has the size of economy to spend money and keep these kinds of loyal supporters around the country. Still, what happened in Tunisia and then in Egypt, the tremors, have been shaking a big section of the Middle East and even North Africa. The protests came back to Iran again in February. Hundreds of thousands of people on February 14th came out and marched on the streets of Tehran. 2 people were killed. 1,500 people were arrested. Still, everybody was wondering what happened. Iranian protests went on for over 6 months. Iranians made their own share of sacrifices. Over 80 people were killed. Hundreds, thousands were arrested, were tortured. But in Egypt, after 17 days, Mubarak left. But Iranians were not even able to get rid of Mr. Ahmadinejad, which was the initial demand of protesters. I don't think what happened in Iran after a year and a half, that the protesters went back to their homes is the end of the story. I think what happened has shaken the foundations of the regime, that the whole thing is the beginning of the end. The Iranians are not going to fall behind from the race for freedom, and it looks like that the tools of repression that worked in this part of the world by many regimes are not working anymore. Protesters in Bahrain, in Jordan, in Syria, and even other parts are continuing to come out and are looking for change. People in these countries are determined to oppose suppressive, repressive regimes. I have come up with a list of 10 major differences between what happened in Iran and what happened in Egypt. Although these countries have many similarities, there are major differences. Each country has its own unique situation and characteristics. Iran is a country of 72 million people. Egypt, 82, almost similar. Both of them are large countries in the region. Both are countries that any change that has happened in these countries has spread to other parts of the region. Iran has 33 million internet users. Egypt has 17 million internet users. Both of them are large numbers. And the numbers are important because internet has become such an important platform for people to produce news, to consume news, to converse, to argue and to raise counter arguments. And it is interesting that on the internet, most of the discourse that has been raised are democratic discourses, as a democratic language. People talk about human rights. Nobody is promoting radical or ideological notions. In Iran, it was important because once the regime cracked down on the internet, once it shut down the internet, and this was not over a period of days or weeks, it dragged on for over a month. The government continued to slow down the internet to a crawl. It managed to disrupt the communities that people had created, the networks that people were creating, and the way they were mobilizing one another and spreading the news and the information. In Egypt, the government did not continue to crack down on the internet the way the Iranians did, so systematically. According to figures by World Bank, in 2005, Iran had 8% of its people living under the poverty line of $2 a day. In Egypt, the number was much higher. It was 18.5 in 2005, which means by 2011, the number was much larger. And this shows that most people who were protesting on the streets in Egypt, they had economic concerns, while in Iran, most of the grievances were political and social. This is gradually changing, especially since this winter when the Iranian government lifted subsidies on energy and basic goods. The price of bread, for instance, which is a major food in Iran, has increased by tenfold. Iranians have just received their second gas and electric bills, and to their shock, they are more than tenfold higher. And that means many families that relied on one or two incomes, they can no longer rely on those. And getting jobs is very hard in Iran. According to official figures, the unemployment rate is 14%, but it is highly believed that the number is around 30%. So economic grievances are going to also increase in Iran. The most important advantage that the movement in Egypt had was that during the protests, the labor organizations and civil servants joined social actors. And that was very important because government employees went on strike, the labor unions joined the protesters, workers in textile mills, pharmaceutical plants, banks, even at the Suez Canal, they went on a strike. And this was very important in Iran. The working class did join the protest, but individually. The unions never made a coalition with activists. There is one labor union leader who has been in jail for several years now, but none of the other labor unions formed a coalition with the activists. The government employees never joined the strikes, and partly because the Iranian regime was not going to pay these people if they didn't show up at work, not like in 1979 when for days workers were not going to work, they were on strike. Even workers at the in the oil industry under the Shah, and finally led to the 1979 revolution. And this is important because workers have a grip on the economy. It is true that students, intellectuals, and activists start revolutions, but once the workers join them, it becomes the tipping point because of their grip over the economy. And unfortunately, this has not happened in Iran, and there's no sign that this is going to happen. In Egypt, the crack within the ruling establishment became very clear from very early on. It became clear that the army was not going to open fire on the demonstrators or to side with Mubarak. We are not aware of the details of the discussions that led to Mubarak stepping down from power, but it seems that pressure from the army played a major role. In Iran, we're not seeing that. In other words, there was, we have exactly the opposite. There was a cartoon exactly at the same time circulating on the internet, and it showed President Ahmadinejad sitting very comfortably with a portrait of the leader over his head, which was a sign that he's still in good terms with the leader, talking to Mubarak on the phone. And he was telling him, how many times did I tell you to create your own paramilitary force? And there was an underlying reality there, and that was that the Iranian regime never relied on the army for its protection. They learned their lesson very well during the 1979 revolution, when the Shah's army turned its back against the regime and sided with the revolutionaries. So after the revolution, the new regime established the Revolutionary Guards and the paramilitary militia force called the Basij. The Basij is comprised of people from the lower classes, mostly villages, poor people who become volunteers, and they are everywhere at schools, at universities, government offices, government buildings, name it, everywhere in the country. They have a huge network. The government claims that there are 10 million Basij forces around the country, but that number is considered to be highly exaggerated. They have about probably 3 to 4 million loyal forces who are willing to support the government, to take all kinds of measures to protect the regime. And these people are rewarded very generously. If they are involved as far as going out on the street to fight against protesters, they're rewarded with jobs, benefits, even businesses. The Revolutionary Guards also has high stakes in the status quo. They have been involved in huge economic investment projects in the country. They build roads in the country. They are involved in developing gas and oil fields. They have economic interest in the current situation. And in addition to that, since early 2000, they have been increasing their grip over politics. They've won seats in parliament. They've had seats in the cabinet, especially in President Ahmadinejad's cabinet. And so they are somehow dependent on the status quo economically and politically. And in the meantime, the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij together, they have learned very well how to deal with protests, unlike the Egyptians. They've been faced with massive protests since 1999, which have repeated every year. People have been coming out in massive numbers. The Revolutionary Guards know how to deal with them. We've never seen a sort of Tiananmen experience in Iran. They don't open fire on people to embarrass themselves and to cause that kind of image in the international community for themselves. They usually have forces who come out, beat up people, disperse crowds. They shut down internet, mobile services, text messaging services. They shut down shops so that people would not have access to water and food, so that they wouldn't be able to stay in one area to continue their protest. In Egypt, it was the opposite. The protesters were camping in Tahrir Square. They clearly had access to food and water day after day. Reporters were never expelled from the country. On the contrary, they were flying in on tourist visas, something that is completely unheard of in Iran. Al Jazeera, despite all the problems that it faced, it had its 24-hour live feed from Cairo, which played an important role in embarrassing Mubarak's government. And the Iranian government has the kind of money to provide the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij with any kind of equipment that they want. During the protest in 2009, it became open that they had purchased equipment from Siemens to find dissidents through their phones. It became a huge embarrassment for Siemens as well. A couple of dissidents who managed to leave the country later on filed cases against the company. In Iran, political power, unlike Egypt and Tunisia, is not in the hands of one man. In Tunisia and in Egypt, when bin Laden and Mubarak left, the political structure pretty much collapsed. In Iran, it's divided among different political institutions. It's true that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, that is very much in control, but there are many other power forces, the Revolutionary Guards, the judiciary, the clerical body of the Guardian Council, and other institutions. And once these people have divided the power amongst themselves, it's much easier for them to be flexible and to put pressure against any kind of protest. When bin Ali or Mubarak left, there was some sort of a vacuum just in 1979. It was very hard to fill that vacuum of power. And the other thing is that the size of Iranian economy makes it harder for corruption to be centered on one person like Mubarak and bin Ali. First of all, in Iran, you cannot find anyone who would point to the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei as a corrupt person. He has very much this reputation that he might be everything, but it is very hard to point to him as a corrupt person. And President Ahmadinejad, it was the same case in 2005. He managed to get elected very much because he was seen as a person who had not been within the establishment. He was running against Rafsanjani, who had become very much the face of corruption. So anyone who was running against him could have got elected. And the other thing is that the size of economy allows various institutions and political factions in the country to have a share of the economy. And beside them, there are a lot of apolitical businessmen and institutions in Iran that have a good share of the wealth. Iran's oil revenue in 2009, was $50 billion, and compare this to Egypt's revenue from tourism and the Suez Canal, it amounted to $20 billion. So it's a huge difference. Another factor in Iran is the ideological context. Iran's supreme leader gets its legitimacy from the fact that he claims he's the representative of God, that he represents a religious government, that he has a religious clout. 98% of Iranians are Muslims. And even though they all do not consider Khamenei as the representative of God, there is still a section that does not want to oppose him simply because they consider the regime as religious. And the government has very much tried to represent any kind of opposition to the government as opposing the religion of God. And the punishment for it is quite serious. They call it irtidad, which means opposing God, and the punishment is death. Animosity with the United States for Iran has been another way of cracking down on any kind of dissent. While in Egypt, it worked against Mubarak. Mubarak had to at least pretend, because of his ties with the United States, that he was not going to use violence against protesters. And once the pressure increased by the United States on Mubarak to step down, he had to somehow comply with that. While in Iran, the Iranian regime goes out of its way to link any kind of opposition to the United States, and the United States is the enemy. We've had the show trials of dissidents who were arrested, many of them former political leaders who were put on trial, and they were accused of having ties with the United States and trying to stage a velvet revolution. Many of them are still in prison. And last, but most important of all, was that the Iranians who came out on the streets after 2009, they did not come out to stage a revolution. They were angry because they felt their votes had been stolen. It was very much a spontaneous uprising. Massive numbers of people poured out on the streets, and their only demand in the beginning was to get their votes back. They wanted new elections to be held. Ahmadinejad had been an embarrassment for them, and they didn't want to have him around, and they felt that they had been deprived of a minimum right that they had, and that was making a choice between the bad and the worst. It was not a democracy. All the candidates had been vetted by the Guardian Council. There was no liberal candidate running, and they had been insulted, and after they stole the elections, Mr. Ahmadinejad came out and called people dirt and dust. So the initial demand was just to have new elections and to get rid of Mr. Ahmadinejad. And once they were faced with violence, the demand went beyond that. They started demanding the removal of the supreme leader. And I believe that's what people want at this stage. Ahmadinejad is not the divisive figure that he was anymore. Now the demands have gone beyond that. But people did not have an agenda for a revolution in 2009 when they came out. And more important than that, they didn't have a leadership. They had no plan, they had no goals. They were coming out in huge numbers, and they were faced with this utter violence. Young people were being arrested, put in jail, they were being tortured. And what was happening was gruesome. The government was trying to make a statement by what it was doing to these people. It went even after the children of some of its own loyal supporters. The son of one of the Revolutionary Guards commanders was arrested, and he was tortured to death. And they publicized what was happening to create this kind of environment of fear and to intimidate the protesters. So after like 6 months, protesters were asking each other, they were asking, what are we doing? We're coming out, we're making sacrifices, we don't have a leader, we don't have an agenda, we have no idea what we're going to do. And so that's how it ended. But the street protests ended. It's not that the protests altogether ended and the regime succeeded in crushing dissent. And by all that, I do not mean to say that change is not going to happen in Iran. I have no doubt that the foundations of the regime has been shaken. I covered Iran since the 90s, and I watched as the crowds of thousands in 99 turned into hundreds of thousands in 2009. I don't think that the dissent, the anger, and the frustration is going away. It's definitely there. It's brewing beneath the surface. It's just a matter of time and how this change is going to come about. Iranian people don't want another revolution. And that's not because they like this regime, not at all. The point is that the memories of the 1979 revolution, the bloodshed, what happened afterwards, the political instability, the institutional breakdown, they are all very much alive in the minds of the majority of people. And after that, they were faced with 8 years of war, bloody war. People do not want chaos. They want change, and they want the change to be grassroots. It seems to me that they are waiting for the system to somehow crumble down on its own, very much like the Soviet Union. Whether that's going to happen or not, we don't know. But there are signs that the fissures within the establishment are increasing, and the worst one was just in the past few weeks when President Ahmadinejad got into a fight with people close to the supreme leader and refused to go to his office for 2 weeks. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let you proceed from here if you have any questions. But this is not the end of it. I am sure that the Iranians are not going to fall behind from the race for freedom that has started in the region.
Hi. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm curious, you said that Ahmadinejad is not seen as a divisive figure, not nearly as divisive as he was once seen. I'm really curious about your insights into him as a man, as a political strategist, whether he's stable or crazy. What makes him tick? What makes him less divisive now? And maybe a little bit more about, I think, your most incisive point, which is that people do not want to relive the revolution. They do not want to relive the years of war between Iraq and Iran, which the U.S., of course, was a major player in. Maybe a little bit more about how large a shadow that casts. But primarily, I'm really curious about your insights into Ahmadinejad, who I'm sure I'm mispronouncing.
No, actually, you pronounced the name very well. Ahmadinejad was the divisive figure in 2009, but once the leader sided with him, and the establishment went out of its way to support him, that changed. It changed very quickly. And it was very obvious from the slogans that people were chanting. I mean, by December, 6 months after the protests, and one of the worst protests took place in December, people were not chanting against Ahmadinejad anymore. The slogans were mostly targeted at Khamenei, the supreme leader. It became very clear that Ahmadinejad had been part of what became known as a coup d'etat, that it was something that had been staged through a troika of alliance among him, the leader, and the Revolutionary Guards. And the differences that they had have been emerging among the three groups. And that's why even now, most of the criticisms are targeted at the leader, the man who is seen by the majority of people as the person who masterminded the whole thing. Ahmadinejad, I mean, he has lived up to his reputation. Whatever you say about him is correct. To be able to not blink or to blush even when, like, tomatoes are thrown at him or large crowds of people are laughing at him, I think needs a special talent. I think he has proven that he has that ability. I don't know if you were following what happened in the past month, but the differences became very clear. Even 25 of close people who were very close to him were arrested last week. And at this stage, he is appearing as the man who might be the one who's going to bring the system down. He's a very ambitious person. He's showing signs that he's not going to be as obedient as he was expected to be to the supreme leader, and that is causing major differences within Iran's political system. The fact that he's competing for presidency for the closest his closest aide is something that we have to watch closely. I mean, that might be the tipping point. His aide Mashai is not very popular among the conservatives. The supreme leader definitely does not approve of him, but his team, Ahmadinejad's team, are very interested to keep him in the picture and to make him the next president.
Thank you. So from your assessment, it does seem to me that I'm not sure whether this is fair to say, but at the change that it does have to come from within. I mean, if the government is willing to torture its people and they're out for 6 months and it doesn't do much, then maybe what you said there, hope that change comes from within. Maybe that is the reasonable path. And you're suggesting that maybe that's happening. So what are the causes of the strife within the establishment? Or is it religious? Or you said 25 close aides to Ahmadinejad were arrested recently. Why was that?
Well, you know, it's very hard to make predictions. I don't think any of us were expecting to see what happened in Tunisia or Egypt just earlier this year. I definitely don't want to make any kind of predictions. I couldn't even see the uprising in 2009, honestly. What happened was just completely unexpected and spontaneous. Maybe people will come out, maybe there will be some kind of public manifestation of people's anger. But the risks are just simply too much, and there's no leadership and no agenda, no agenda that can be seen and felt. The rifts within the establishment are definitely increasing. How fatal they're going to be, we don't know. Ayatollah Khamenei has been very successful in alienating all those forces who were not loyal to him. Even the closest person to him, Rafsanjani, who was one of the founders of the Islamic Republic, and he's practically one of the partners, one of the owners of the revolution. He would have never done anything to jeopardize the revolution, but he even alienated him and turned him into some sort of opposition figure. The question is now how serious the rifts among the three factions of the leader, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Khamenei's faction are going to become. Most of people who are close to Khamenei, including the Revolutionary Guards, are a group of upstart politicians who are very obedient to him, very much dependent on Khamenei for both economic and political upward mobility. So it is unlikely to expect them to do anything out of ordinary. But Ahmadinejad's faction have been very ambitious, and there have been numerous signs that Ahmadinejad is the kind of person who might do things on his own.
I was just wondering, with all the recent unrest in Syria, I know that there's pretty close, at least ideological alliance between Iran and Syria's pretty key geographic location. And you mentioned just kind of the internal uprising, shaking the foundations of the regime. I'm sure they're kind of sweating, watching what's going on. And it's been interesting seeing a difference in reporting between what's happening in Syria and Libya and stuff. And it just seems like there's a lot more pieces balancing each other out. And I was wondering, how that's kind of reflected in what's going on in the regime in Iran right now.
It's been very hard for Iran to respond to all the changes in the region. When changes started happening in Tunisia and Egypt, they started referring to it as a kind of Islamic awakening, and they thought that their sort of influence in the region is going to increase because they started promising that the Islamists are going to come to power, even though there was no proof for that, but that's how they tried to interpret it until things started happening in other parts, especially in Syria, and they have a hard time reacting to it. And it's not even Syria, it's even in Bahrain. The government, from one side, it was supporting the suppression of protesters in Syria and even in Iran, but then it was reacting to the suppression of protesters in Bahrain because they were Shiites. And Iran's ties with the countries, the Gulf countries, has been strained. It's not that whatever has been happening, Iranians have been able to interpret it in a way that their influence is increasing. It's very interesting that Iran's ties with Saudi Arabia has never been as bad as it's been in recent months, partly because the Gulf countries are very much threatened by Iran's influence over their Shiite communities. They've been giving warnings. At one point in March, one of the ministers at the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, even said that the Gulf countries should go into war with Iran because they felt that the Iranians were supporting their Shiite communities. Iran hasn't had a very active foreign policy in the region yet. Most of it has been rhetoric, claiming that they support the movements in Syria, in Tunisia, but what is happening in Syria is being masterminded by the foreign enemies, again, supporting what happened in Bahrain. It's been quite strange. I'm not sure if we can interpret what is happening in the region to the advantage of Iran, that Iran's influence is going to increase.
I'm curious about the press. How are they reporting what's going on in the rest of the region? And how active is the intercommunication on Twitter and things like that?
You mean the Iranian press, right?
Yes, in the Iranian press.
Well, what's been happening in the Iranian press is being mostly reported by the state media. And the state media is trying to present a picture based on its own interests and interpretations. As I said, the events in Tunisia and Egypt were very much portrayed as a kind of Islamic awakening, and that the Islamic revolution is going to happen in these countries. It's been quite different in the independent media since 2009. Pretty much the landscape has changed. The number of independent newspapers has dramatically dwindled. They are not free to write whatever they want to. I mean, the situation has become so bad that they cannot even use the term green movement. Newspapers can get shut down. So think about other things if they want to write about events in other parts of the world. Green movement was like one of the most significant events of our recent history just 2 years ago, and they cannot even refer to it. But what is interesting is that the majority of Iranians started seeing what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, very similar to what happened in 1979. Not that there are similarities now, but I think it was their sense of disillusionment with what happened in 1979 in Iran, that they got rid of the Shah, but they didn't get rid of dictatorship. That has been the major, the widespread understanding of people that this is going to happen, that this is not the end for Egypt and Tunisia, that this is just the beginning of a long process. I'm sure that things are very different. Iran has been an example for these countries, and they will probably not go to the lengths that the Iranian regime went. And I'm sorry, what was your second question? Twitter. Twitter was a big lie. In 2009, when they were calling it a Twitter revolution, there were 1,000 registered Twitter users in Iran. And they were talking about a country of 70 million people, 33 million internet users, so 1,000 is nothing. And from the day of the election, the internet was slowed down to a crawl. It was impossible to get on Twitter. The tweets were coming mostly from other parts of the world, by Iranians probably, but they were not by Iranians. And you know, Twitter has never been on cell phones. Iranian phones have never had internet access. So when you were reading on Twitter that, like for instance, there is a demonstration at this part of Tehran, and I'm here, and like 2 people are killed, that was all fabricated. Internet did play a role in mobilizing people, in creating networks, in spreading the news. A lot of people were using their cell phones to capture videos, and they were using the internet to circulate it, and satellite TV was picking up those images and showing it to a much larger audience. I mean, the internet was a tool, but there was no such thing as the Twitter revolution or the role of Twitter. Sure.
It's interesting listening to you contrast Egypt from Iran, and the cross-infection that happened so quickly in the region. I guess a lot of people, or at least I felt this is going to be the spark that will bring together the group that had only 2 years before created all these connections. And I wonder if you can look, rather than looking from the policy position or even the press position, but looking from the grassroots, why all this tumult that's going on in the region now isn't reigniting what has to be a network of connections, a whole, essentially a practice run at a revolution that occurred 2 years ago. Why wouldn't this re-spark it when a lot of the conditions you described have in fact become more likely to trigger that over the intervening 2 years? What's stopping that from happening in Iran?
Well, you know, what happened has given, events in Tunisia and Egypt have given a lot of confidence to people everywhere. Definitely, in even countries that you were not expecting any kind of uprising. In Iran, it has given people a lot of confidence too. And on February 14, they planned this demonstration in solidarity with people in Tunisia and Egypt. And despite whatever has happened, hundreds of thousands of people came out. I spoke to people on the streets who were saying they were definitely the protests were as large as the protests in the summer of 2009, but it was very hard to report it. There were no reporters, and again, the internet was shut down. And the Iranian regime definitely felt very threatened because it was then that they put the opposition leaders under house arrest, and they practically evicted Rafsanjani from politics. They took away the powerful position that he had as the head of the Council of Experts, the council that has the power to dismiss the supreme leader. So the establishment definitely felt very threatened. But as I said, it was either disillusionment or lack of ability to muster support. I think most important of all is the lack of goal and agenda and leadership. What are people supposed to do? To come out in the streets to overthrow who? To overthrow what? It's not one man like Mubarak. We're talking about a regime that is like an octopus. It has so many different factions. Even if they overthrow one, the other one would take the place of the other. And then the regime is armed to its teeth and is going to extraordinary lengths to crush dissent.
Comment on the thesis that most of the governments in the whole region have almost total control over the economy, so that the only way to get change is through the government, and every time there's a change, none of the government systems change, and you end up right back in the same place. And I don't sense that there has been really any freedom of economic choices in any of the countries. And I think it prevents change from happening.
Well, yes, you're right. And as long as they have the oil money, these governments, they're independent from the support of their own people. And they do whatever they want to do. They buy support, they suppress their people. I think the only miracle is for the oil prices to go down, which doesn't seem very...
Hi, so you said the regime is like an octopus, but nonetheless you've made it sound like an octopus that's about to fall apart. So with that in mind, do you believe that the West can or should do anything to either encourage the Iranian opposition or to encourage the fall of the regime? Not militarily, but anything else?
Well, you know, the reason I say that this octopus is going to fall apart is because no dictatorial regime can last so long without the support of their people. And this dissent is just growing. I mean, it's beyond imagination. I mean, you walk on the streets, you meet government officials, and nobody supports this regime. People who are related to people in power, even their own children, they don't support this regime. So how do you want this regime? I mean, it has to either reshape itself, it has to change, which is what most people want. They don't want any kind of collapse. So eventually, I mean, this is what's going to happen. But what can the West do? The West can do a lot. I mean, the sanctions are not only not helping to weaken, to undermine the regime, they are putting pressure on the people. For instance, I mean, we're talking about internet. The internet, that its role was so glorified in bringing change in Tunisia and Egypt. The Iranians have to rely on the internet that is provided by the Revolutionary Guards for them. The Iranian people have to use the telephone lines that are provided by the Iranian regime that are intercepted. Satellite internet is over Iran. And a lot of companies that are offering satellite internet would love to sell it to Iranians, but because of the sanctions, they cannot. Because of the sanctions, Iranian cannot buy even Skype credits to talk on lines that they feel is safer. Because of the sanctions, the Revolutionary Guards have even increased their grip over the economy. They have their own ports, and they have the kind of money to buy whatever they want. They control the black markets. I mean, you think that because of the sanctions, there should be no American goods in Iran, but name whatever you want and you can find it in Iranian markets. Thanks to the Revolutionary Guards. They buy it more expensive from other places, and they bring them into the country. Last year, there was this big story, the Iranian journalist who was arrested in Italy. And he was sort of this proxy person who was helping the Iranian government buy arms, helicopter and military spare parts, name it, whatever you want, through Italian companies. So they have money, they have the oil income, and through other it's 30 years that the Iranian regime is under sanctions. They have found ways to tackle with it.
Thank you. In light of what's happened in Pakistan, how are Iran and Pakistan now going to get along if the U.S. starts leaving or doubting the Pakistani government? Is there a new relationship there brewing?
Well, Iran and Pakistan have always tried to maintain a kind of safe relationship. The situation has never been that tense. I mean, nearly as tense that it's got with Saudi Arabia or other neighboring countries. They have made, I mean, especially because of the pipeline that Iran wants to build through Pakistan to India. So Iran, which sounds more like a dream project, but Iran has tried to maintain a reasonable relationship with Pakistan. And I mean, if you're referring to bin Laden, eliminating bin Laden is another dream for Iran to come true. Sure.
Who was the other one? Hi. You mentioned that in 2009, the Ayatollah and the Iranian government associated protesters with Americans and American influence. Sorry. But I'm just wondering, what is your take on sort of like the general feelings towards Americans among average Iranians?
America is the only country in the region that is pro-America, pro-United States, when you compare Iran with other countries, especially the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, Iranians in general. There was a poll in 2000, according to which the majority of Iranians wanted relations with the United States, and those who were behind the poll were put in prison because the government was too embarrassed about it.
Considering that Iran has considerable oil resources, is there effort to develop atomic energy to get more energy, or is it to build a bomb?
That's the $1 million question. You know, that's a tricky question, because that's one of those things that even people who are against the regime are are quite sensitive about. The government has managed to turn the whole nuclear program issue into a national issue. People compare it to the 1953 nationalization of oil. And you ask people, it has become a slogan. People keep on saying, "It's nuclear program is our right." But there are two aspects to that. First of all, Iranians are quite educated, very ambitious, and even under the Shah, it was one of Shah's ambitions, and the whole nuclear program started then, that Iran should limit its reliance on the fossil energy, and the Islamic regime started pursuing those ambitions as well. Whether those programs are really for energy purposes and not for weaponization purposes is a totally different thing. I mean, a lot of people would tell you that no doubt this regime is after nuclear program, nuclear weapons, a nuclear bomb. And you ask people on the streets what they think about it, and I mean, I've come across so many people. You ask them about nuclear program, and they tell you that, well, if we had the nuclear bomb, Saddam wouldn't have attacked us. I mean, the line between nuclear energy and the nuclear weapon is quite murky. And a lot of people say, well, Israel has it in the region. Pakistan, our neighboring country, has it in the region. Why shouldn't we have it? Why shouldn't we be a powerful country? Because Iran is very alienated in the region. I mean, this is this Persian country surrounded by these hostile Arab countries. And just remember that during the war with Iraq, none of these countries, except for Libya, were supporting Iran. Iran practically defended or fought an 8-year wall with human shield. I mean, any regime that comes to power would pursue this program. Whether, if it's a more responsible government, it would be for energy purposes. But the ambitions will probably always be there.
Thank you. I've enjoyed very much your talk. It's been very, very helpful. Would you say more about the Revolutionary Guards? I don't understand from what I've read and what you've said quite how that entity is structured, how it's managed, commanded, so that it has the force of being one of that triumvirate of power in Iran today.
Well, that's a very good question, because Revolutionary Guards is not this united entity. And if you remember in 1997, during the presidential elections, the authorities found out that the majority of members of the Revolutionary Guards had voted for the reformist candidate, Mohammad Khatami, and not for the conservative candidate. And it was then that the leadership realized that this force was not completely under its control. And it was since then that Ayatollah Khamenei, who has the power to appoint the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, kept on replacing new ones until the recent ones that are in power. And they started forcing a lot of senior Revolutionary Guards who had also fought during the war into retirement. They got rid of a lot of the older ones, and the reason for that was many of them were more loyal to Rafsanjani, who had been the commander of the Revolutionary Guards during the war. He was much more powerful and influential during the war than Khamenei. So Khamenei got rid of those commanders who were more loyal to him. And he brought up a group of upstart Revolutionary Guards who were completely dependent on him. And it was since then that they started awarding them with seats in parliament, with positions in the cabinet, and they started giving them a lot of economic roles, which was new in Iran. I mean, a lot of oil and gas development projects that were previously given to foreign companies were given to the Revolutionary Guards. They were almost unilaterally in charge of developing and building roads around the country. They have their own car manufacturing industries now. So that has expanded them into a huge force around the country. And in fact, since 2009, the country has very much shifted from being a religious country into a military one, because the Revolutionary Guards have very much managed to alienate the traditional clergy. You don't hear from the traditional clergy. It's Ayatollah Khamenei who doesn't even get his legitimacy from Qom anymore. President Ahmadinejad does not even have somebody who historically had been the link between the president and the religious city of Qom. So that tie has completely vanished, and we have seen many clerics who have become dissidents in the past year.
Could you talk a little bit about the Shiite and Sunni, the personalities that these different groups would play in leading the country?
In Iran, the Sunnis don't play a role at all. They are the religious minority. The Sunni areas are the most deprived and the poorest areas in the country, namely the Baluchis, and they are the ethnic groups as well. The Sunni areas in Iran are the Baluchis near the border with Pakistan, the province close to Pakistan, the Arabs close to Iraq, and the Kurds. So the Sunnis are very much discriminated against. They don't have positions in the government. They're just few percent. The country is basically ruled by the Shiite clerics.
Thank you. Picking up on the last question, to what degree should we be paying attention to the Sunni, Shia, or Saudi, Iran rivalries in the sense that what's going on there might transcend what's going on individually in the countries? There seems to be so much posturing going on. And
well, in terms of internal politics, the Sunnis have been discriminated against so much that all they want is like more development in their areas, better jobs, more economic investments in their provinces, and just being able to move up in politics and in society. But in terms of external politics, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is major. Both countries are competing for influence in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Gulf countries, in Bahrain. I mean, wherever there is a Shiite community, Iran is trying to turn them into its own proxy and its own arms in those countries. And the Sunnis, Arab countries, are not happy about it at all. So that has been a big source of friction.
Hello, thanks for speaking. I have a question in terms of Iran's relationship with Turkey. I'm really not sure, like, how's the relationship, like, socially, politically, economically? Is it cold? Is it friendly? Like, how are they relating to each other?
Well, relations between Turkey and Iran has improved a lot, especially because of the role that Turkey tried to assume over Iran's nuclear program. Turkey tried to mediate and to reach some kind of deal over Iran's nuclear program, but it didn't work. So it's been full of ups and downs. Well, thank you very much.